The millionaire ignored the boy for years, until a single word made him collapse. Dad. He built $1 million empire, but in the silence of a hospital hallway, it all collapsed. A boy stared at him with familiar eyes, and with one single word, shattered the wall he spent years building. What the boy wanted wasn't money. The polished marble floors of Boston's Brigham Hospital reflected the harsh fluorescent lights as Reed Blackwood stormed through the corridor, his custom Italian shoes clicking with each determined step. At 43, the hedge fund manager's ruthless reputation preceded him like a dark shadow. "Mr. Blackwood, please, you need to sign these consent forms before—" The nurse struggled to keep pace. "I don't have time for paperwork," Reed snapped, checking his platinum watch. "My jet leaves in 90 minutes. Just take whatever's needed from my insurance." He pushed through the double doors into the private room where his mother lay connected to machines that beeped rhythmically, mapping her weakening heartbeat. At 71, Margaret Blackwood's once formidable presence had withered along with her cancer-ravaged body. "Reed," she whispered, her voice thin as paper. "You came." "Of course I came." He stood awkwardly at her bedside, briefcase still in hand. "The doctors say the new treatment is promising. Sit down." It was not a request. Even dying, Margaret commanded respect. When he hesitated, she added, "It's time we discussed Mason." Reed's jaw tightened. "There's nothing to discuss. He's 12 now. Your son is 12 years old, and you've never once—" "He is not my son." Reed's voice cut through the room like a blade. "We settled this years ago. Olivia got her money, and that boy is—" "Your flesh and blood," Margaret interrupted, her frail hand suddenly gripping his wrist with surprising strength. "And I've been sending them money every month since you refused." Reed pulled away, his face flushing with anger. "You did what? The boy lives 10 miles from your penthouse. He's brilliant, kind, everything you could be proud of if you bothered to know him." Each word seemed to cost Margaret precious energy. "I'm dying, Reed. My final wish is for you to meet him." "This is emotional manipulation, Mother. I won't—" "I've arranged it already," she interrupted. "Tomorrow at noon. Here." The monitors began beeping faster as Margaret's breathing grew labored. A nurse rushed in, assessing the situation quickly. "Sir, you need to step out now." Reed backed toward the door, his composure cracking. "This discussion is over." "No," Margaret gasped as the nurse adjusted her oxygen. "It's just beginning. If you ever wanted my approval, ever wanted the rest of what Thomas left, you'll be here tomorrow." Reed froze at the mention of his late father's fortune. The portion he hadn't inherited remained in a trust controlled by his mother's will. "Are you blackmailing me from your deathbed?" he asked, incredulously. Margaret's eyes held his with unwavering determination. "I'm giving you one last chance to be the man I raised you to be." As Reed stormed out, a small figure in a worn blue backpack pressed against the corridor wall to avoid collision. The boy's eyes, startlingly familiar in shape and color, followed the millionaire's retreating form. "Excuse me," the nurse called to the child. "Are you Mason? Your grandmother's been asking for you." Reed's steps faltered for just a heartbeat before he quickened his pace, refusing to look back at the boy he'd spent 12 years pretending didn't exist. Reed's penthouse overlooking Boston Harbor represented everything he'd built, 46 floors above the gritty realities of ordinary life. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the glittering water, but tonight the view failed to soothe him. "Should I reschedule tomorrow's investors?" asked Vanessa, his executive assistant, as she arranged documents on his desk. "No." Reed poured himself 3 fingers of 30-year Macallan. "Everything proceeds as planned. But your mother will understand that Blackwood Capital doesn't stop for personal matters." The ice clinked against crystal as he took a long swallow. "That's what made us successful in the first place." Vanessa's professional mask slipped momentarily. "Reed, she might not have much time left." Few people could address him so familiarly. After 12 years as his right hand, Vanessa had earned the privilege, though she rarely exercised it. Reed scrolled through emails on his phone, deliberately avoiding her concerned gaze. "Did you know she's been sending money to Olivia Bradley all these years?" Vanessa's silence was answer enough. "You knew." It wasn't a question. "She asked me to courier the envelope sometimes," Vanessa admitted. "I thought you had arranged it." Reed drained his glass, the alcohol burning a path to his stomach but failing to calm the storm inside him. 12 years ago, Olivia had been a brief distraction, a pretty research analyst with ambitious eyes. The pregnancy had been inconvenient, her refusal to handle it infuriating. He'd paid her off, organized the paperwork denying paternity despite the tests, and closed that chapter of his life. Or so he'd thought. "The board meeting is at 3 tomorrow, Vanessa reminded him. "The acquisition paperwork needs your signature before then." "I'm aware of my schedule." His tone ended further discussion. After Vanessa left, Reed loosened his tie and stared at the reflection in the window. A successful man by every measurable standard. Forbes had estimated his worth at $1.8 billion last quarter. His investment strategies were legendary, his client list exclusive, his influence in financial circles unmatched in Boston. So why did his mother's words leave him feeling like that desperate scholarship student from South Providence who'd clawed his way into Dartmouth? His phone buzzed with a text from Margaret's primary physician. "Your mother's condition has stabilized, but time is limited. Days, perhaps a week." Reed placed the phone face down without responding and opened his laptop. Work had always been his refuge. The numbers and strategies, a clean, predictable universe, unlike the messy complications of personal relationships. But tonight, between quarterly projections and market analyses, Reed found himself opening a private browser window. He typed, "Mason Bradley, Boston." The search returned several results, including a news article about regional math competition winners. The photograph showed a lanky boy with serious eyes holding a trophy, his smile tentative as if unaccustomed to victory. The caption read, "Mason Bradley, 12, Brighton Middle School." Reed stared at the image, searching for himself in the boy's features while simultaneously hoping to find nothing. The shape of the eyes, the set of the jaw. The resemblance was subtle, but undeniable. "Damn you, mother," he muttered, closing the browser and returning to his spreadsheets. The night stretched before him, sleep unlikely. Tomorrow's choice loomed: meet the boy and secure his inheritance, or stand firm on the principle that had guided his adult life. Never look back, never acknowledge mistakes, never show weakness. Either way, something irreplaceable would be lost. In a modest two-bedroom apartment in Brighton, Mason Bradley completed his algebra homework with methodical precision. Though advanced for 7th grade, math had always been the easy part. It was the human equations that confused him. "You're still up?" His mother, Olivia, appeared in the doorway, her nurse's scrubs wrinkled from a 12-hour shift at the same hospital where her son's grandmother lay dying. "Just finishing." Mason closed his notebook. "How was work?" "Busy." Olivia's exhaustion couldn't mask her warmth as she kissed the top of his head. "Any word from the hospital?" Mason shook his head. "Grandma Margaret was sleeping when I visited, but..." He hesitated, unsure how to describe the encounter in the hallway. "I think I saw him. My father." The change in Olivia was subtle but immediate, a straightening of her shoulders, a careful neutrality settling over her features. "What makes you think that?" "The nurses called him Mr. Blackwood. He looked like the picture from your old yearbook, only older." Mason studied his mother's reaction. "He didn't see me. Or maybe he pretended not to." Olivia sat on the edge of the bed, choosing her words carefully. "Mason, I've never kept the truth from you. Your father made it clear he didn't want to be part of our lives." "But Grandma Margaret does," Mason countered. "She shows up. She remembers my birthdays. She asks about school. Margaret is complicated." Olivia tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, a nervous habit Mason recognized. She initially took his side, Then something changed when you were about 4. The apartment felt suddenly smaller, the walls of their carefully constructed life together straining against unspoken histories. Mason had spent years constructing theories about his absent father, elaborate justifications that preserved the possibility of redemption. The man in the hospital corridor had shattered those fantasies with his cold, dismissive presence. "He's rich, isn't he?" Mason asked. "I looked him up once at the library. Reed Blackwood, CEO of Blackwood Capital." "He was in Forbes." Olivia sighed. "Money doesn't make someone a good person, Mason. Is that why you never took more from him? The article said he's worth billions." "I took what we needed to get started," Olivia explained, the old defensiveness creeping into her voice. "I wanted us to make our own way." In the small living room, framed nursing credentials hung alongside Mason's academic achievements. Their life was modest but dignified, built on Olivia's determination to provide stability despite initial hardships. The envelopes from Margaret had helped during tough times, though Olivia had always been transparent about their source. "Grandma Margaret wants me to meet him, officially." Mason fidgeted with his pencil. "Tomorrow at the hospital." "And what do you want?" Olivia asked, always careful to respect her son's agency despite her protective instincts. Mason considered the question, the weight of tomorrow's potential meeting settling in his chest. For years, his father had been an abstraction, a missing piece that Mason had convinced himself didn't matter. But seeing the man in person had awakened something primal and painful. "I want to know why I wasn't enough," he answered finally, his voice small. "What was so wrong with me that he could just walk away and never look back?" Olivia pulled her son into a fierce hug, her heart breaking for the question no mother could adequately answer. "Nothing is wrong with you. Nothing. Some people aren't capable of being what others need them to be." Later, after his mother had gone to bed, Mason opened his desk drawer and removed the only photograph he had of Reed Blackwood, a newspaper clipping announcing a major business acquisition. He studied the man's confident pose, searching for connections between this stranger and himself. They had the same eyes. Did they share anything else? Mathematical aptitude? The furrow that appeared between their brows when concentrating? Or perhaps darker traits? The capacity for abandonment, for calculating human worth in cold, transactional terms. Mason placed the clipping back in his drawer. Tomorrow would bring answers, or at least the opportunity to ask questions that had lingered for 12 years. Whether his father appeared or not would itself be an answer of sorts. The Boston skyline glowed against the dawn as Reed's private car navigated early morning traffic. He hadn't slept. The acquisition document sat reviewed and annotated beside him, work completed with mechanical efficiency despite his distraction. "We've arrived, sir," his driver announced as they pulled up to Blackwood Capital's gleaming headquarters. Reed checked his watch. 7:15 a.m., nearly 5 hours until the hospital meeting his mother had arranged. Plenty of time to lose himself in the familiar rhythm of deals and decisions that required no emotional investment. "Mr. Blackwood." Gerald, the head of legal, intercepted him at the elevator. "The Wu Group is wavering on terms. They're asking for additional concessions." "They're testing our resolve," Reed replied, stepping into his corner office. "Tell them our offer stands as presented. If they're not at the table by noon, we'll approach their competitors." The morning unfolded in a parade of conference calls and strategy sessions. Reed performed flawlessly, his reputation for laser focus intact, despite the undercurrent of tension running through him. At 11:30, Vanessa appeared in his doorway. "Your mother's doctor called. She's had a difficult morning." Reed continued reviewing documents without looking up. And your meeting is in 30 minutes. Vanessa's tone held unusual edge. "Your car is waiting." "Cancel it." Reed initialed the final page of the contract. "The Wu Group has agreed to our terms. We're finalizing at 1 o'clock. Vanessa didn't move. "Reed, this meeting is a manipulation," he interrupted. "My mother is using her condition to force a confrontation I've made clear I don't want. This isn't just about Margaret. Vanessa placed a folder on his desk. It's about a 12-year-old boy who deserves... What exactly does he deserve from me? Reed's controlled facade cracked momentarily. I provided financial support. His mother chose to raise him knowing my position. What more? Basic human acknowledgement, Vanessa answered quietly. The truth. Reed's phone buzzed with a text from the hospital. Margaret, asking if you're coming. Mason is here. Something tight and uncomfortable formed in Reed's chest. He recalled the glimpse of the boy in the corridor. Thin shoulders, watchful eyes that seemed to contain an old soul's understanding. The Wu contract, he began. Can be handled by Gerald, Vanessa finished. That's why you built a team. Reed stood abruptly, straightening his tie. This changes nothing. I'm going to tell them both, to their faces, that my position remains the same. Then this farce is finished. Vanessa nodded, her expression unreadable as she gathered the documents he'd need to sign after the meeting. The drive to Brigham Hospital passed in tense silence. Reed rehearsed what he would say, firm but not cruel, definitive without unnecessary emotion. He would offer financial support directly now that his mother had exposed the arrangement, perhaps a trust fund for education. But no relationship, no false promises, no disruption to lives already established in separate orbits. As the car approached the hospital entrance, Reed's phone lit up with multiple notifications. The Wu Group representatives had arrived early and were waiting in the conference room. The board chairman needed to speak urgently about regulatory concerns. The market was responding to rumors of the acquisition. Reed closed his eyes briefly, the competing demands crystallizing his choice. Business, the world he understood and controlled, versus an emotional confrontation with no predictable outcome. Sir? The driver waited for instruction. Reed made his decision. Take me back to the office. As the car pulled away from the hospital curb, Reed glimpsed a woman in nurse's scrubs helping a lanky boy from a modest sedan. Something in their ordinary, unguarded interaction, the woman's protective hand on the boy's shoulder, the boy's obvious nervousness, triggered a memory Reed had long suppressed. His own father's perpetual absence, the succession of missed school events, the hollowness of material provision without presence. Wait, Reed ordered, the word escaping before he could reconsider. But the car had already merged into traffic, carrying him back toward the gleaming tower where Reed Blackwood, financial genius, would make another billion-dollar decision, while his flesh and blood waited in a hospital room for a man who had chosen, once again, not to appear. The hospital room was unnaturally quiet, save for the steady beeping of machines monitoring Margaret Blackwood's fragile hold on life. Mason sat beside the bed, his sneakers not quite touching the floor, while his mother stood near the window. He's not coming, is he? Mason asked, glancing at the clock, 12:47 p.m. Margaret's eyes fluttered open. Though weakened, her gaze remained sharp. He'll be here, she insisted. Reed has always operated on his own schedule. Olivia exchanged a look with her son, their unspoken communication reflecting years of shared disappointments carefully processed and overcome together. Perhaps we should reschedule, Margaret. You need rest. What I need, the elderly woman replied with surprising firmness, is for my son to honor his word and meet his child. Mason studied his grandmother's face, the aristocratic features now drawn with pain, the determination that animated her despite her body's betrayal. He recognized himself in her stubbornness, in the slight angle of her jawline that he saw in his own reflection. It's okay, Grandma, he said, gently patting her hand. Maybe it's better this way. But Margaret wouldn't surrender. Tell me about your science project while we wait. Mason launched into an explanation of his research on urban water quality, his natural enthusiasm temporarily overriding his disappointment. As he spoke, Olivia marveled at her son's resilience, his ability to shine despite the shadow cast by Reed's absence. At 1:15, Dr. Chen entered with Margaret's updated test results. The news was delivered in gentle clinical terms, but the meaning was clear. Days had become hours. "I'd like to speak with my grandson alone," Margaret requested after the doctor left. Olivia hesitated, protective instincts flaring. "It's okay, Mom," Mason assured her. "I'll be right here." When the door closed behind Olivia, Margaret beckoned Mason closer. "I've made many mistakes," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "When Olivia first told Reed about you, I supported his decision. I thought it was a ploy, a young woman trying to secure a future through my son's success." Mason listened intently, this piece of family history new to him. "Then your mother sent me something," Margaret continued. "Your first mathematical assessment. You were 4, already showing exceptional ability." A ghost of a smile crossed her lips. "Just like Reed at that age. That's when I knew." "Knew what?" Mason asked. "That you were a Blackwood, through and through. That denying you was denying our family's future." Her breath hitched with emotion or pain, perhaps both. "I tried to persuade Reed, but his mind was set. So I did what I could from a distance." Mason thought about the birthday cards, the encouraging notes after academic competitions, the envelopes that arrived when money was tight. "Your father," Margaret paused, choosing her words carefully. "Reed built walls around himself after his own father's neglect. Thomas was brilliant but cold, present in their home but absent in all ways that mattered. Reed learned early that achievement brought the only approval he could expect." "Is that why he doesn't want to know me?" Mason asked, the question that had haunted him for years, finally spoken aloud. "Because his dad was mean to him?" Margaret squeezed his hand weakly. "People who've been hurt often continue the pattern. It's not an excuse, just a broken piece in a broken man." Outside the room, Olivia paced the corridor, her nurse's training battling her maternal anxiety. This hospital had been her workplace for 8 years, but today the familiar hallways felt hostile, the institutional lighting harsh on her tired eyes. "Ms. Bradley." Olivia turned to find a professionally dressed woman approaching, her expression apologetic. "I'm Vanessa Parks, Mr. Blackwood's executive assistant." She held out a business card. "Reed sends his regrets, but an urgent business matter required his attention." Olivia accepted the card mechanically, anger and old pain rising like bile. "Of course. Multi-billion-dollar empires don't run themselves, do they?" Vanessa winced slightly. "He asked me to provide this." She offered a sealed envelope. "It's a trust fund established for Mason's education. Ivy League, graduate school, whatever path he chooses." Olivia stared at the envelope without taking it, years of carefully managed emotions threatening to overflow. 12 years of absence, and he thinks money is the answer? "Ms. Bradley, does he even know what Mason looks like?" Olivia's voice trembled. "His favorite subject? Whether he's right or left-handed? If he has allergies or nightmares or friends or—" She stopped, collecting herself. "Please tell Mr. Blackwood we don't need his money. What Mason needed was a father, but that opportunity expired years ago." Inside the hospital room, Mason listened as his grandmother's breathing grew more labored. He should call his mother, alert a nurse, but something in Margaret's expression held him still. "Promise me something," Margaret whispered. "Anything," Mason answered. "Don't give up on him," she said. "Reed needs you more than he knows." The acquisition celebration filled Blackwood Capital's executive floor with expensive champagne and calculated camaraderie. Reed moved through the crowd accepting congratulations, his external performance flawless despite the hollow feeling that had plagued him since choosing the Woo Group meeting over the hospital. "To the visionary who just added another billion to our portfolio," toasted Gerald, raising his glass. "No one closes like Reed Blackwood." Applause rippled through the gathering of executives and investors. Reed nodded acknowledgement, scanning the room for Vanessa, who had disappeared immediately after the contracts were signed. His phone vibrated in his pocket, the 5th call from the hospital in the past hour. Slipping away from the celebration, Reed retreated to his office and finally answered. Blackwood speaking. Mr. Blackwood, this is Dr. Chen from Brigham Hospital. I've been trying to reach you regarding your mother. Something in the doctor's tone sent a chill through Reed. What's happened? Her condition deteriorated rapidly this afternoon. I'm afraid we're looking at hours now, not days. She's asking for you. Reed gripped the edge of his desk, the weight of his earlier decision suddenly crushing. I'll be there immediately. As he gathered his coat, Gerald appeared in the doorway. The Jakarta investors are requesting a private word before they commit. Handle it, Reed ordered, already moving toward the elevator. Family emergency. The words felt foreign in his mouth. In 15 years at Blackwood Capital, Reed had never prioritized family over business, not once. Boston traffic crawled with maddening slowness. Reed found himself calculating his mother's remaining time with the same analytical precision he applied to market fluctuations. The variables were different, but the fundamental question identical. Would he arrive in time? When his phone rang again, Reed expected the hospital. Instead, Vanessa's name appeared on the screen. Where are you? He demanded without preamble. Still at Brigham, she answered. I've been here since delivering your message to Ms. Bradley. Reed frowned. That was hours ago. Someone needed to represent the family, Vanessa replied, a rare edge in her voice. And speaking of family, there's something you should know. I'm already on my way. Dr. Chen called. It's not just about Margaret, Vanessa said. It's Mason. He hasn't left her side, Reed. Not to eat or rest. He's been reading to her, talking to her about mathematics and science, holding her hand through pain episodes. He's 12 years old and showing more emotional fortitude than... She stopped herself. Than me. Reed finished, an uncomfortable truth settling in his chest. How much has my mother told him? Everything, I think, Vanessa answered. About Thomas, about your childhood, about the choices you've made. Reed closed his eyes briefly, imagining this boy, his boy, absorbing the complicated legacy of the Blackwood family, connecting puzzle pieces that revealed patterns of abandonment and emotional distance replicated across generations. And Olivia? He asked, remembering the fierce research analyst who had refused his financial solution 12 years ago. Working her shift in the oncology ward. Apparently she couldn't get coverage, and they need the hours. Vanessa's implication was clear. Unlike Reed, Olivia couldn't delegate her responsibilities, regardless of personal crisis. The hospital loomed ahead, its windows illuminated against the darkening Boston skyline. Reed instructed his driver to drop him at the main entrance, then hesitated with his hand on the door. Vanessa, he said, uncharacteristic uncertainty in his voice. What do I say to him? Her response was gentle, but unflinching. The truth might be a good place to start. The hospital corridors seemed endless as Reed made his way to the private wing. Outside his mother's room, he paused, glimpsing through the partially open door the scene within. Margaret in the hospital bed, noticeably weaker than yesterday, and beside her, a boy with dark hair bent over what appeared to be a chessboard, balanced on the bedside table. Knight to e5, Mason said, moving a piece. Check. A weak smile crossed Margaret's face. Just like your father, always 3 moves ahead. Reed's stomach clenched at the comparison, the easy acknowledgement of a connection he had spent 12 years denying. He pushed the door open wider, and 2 pairs of identical eyes turned toward him. Recognition flickered across Mason's face. The man from the corridor, the father from photographs and internet searches, the absent figure whose DNA had shaped his features, and perhaps his mind. Reed, Margaret whispered, reaching out a trembling hand. You came. I'm sorry I'm late, he said, the inadequacy of the words striking him as he spoke them. Mason stood, uncertainty and raw vulnerability evident in his posture. The chess piece, a white knight, remained clutched in his fingers, a child's instinctive anchor in emotional turbulence. For one suspended moment, the 3 generations of Blackwoods regarded each other in silence, past, present, and future linked by blood and choices, by wounds inflicted and inherited, by possibilities for healing not yet explored. Then Margaret's monitors began to screech, and the fragile moment shattered as medical staff rushed into the room. "Cardiac event," called a nurse, pressing the emergency button. "Get the crash cart!" Reed found himself pushed against the wall as doctors surrounded his mother. Mason backed toward the door, his face pale with shock. Without thinking, Reed reached out and gripped the boy's shoulder, steadying him as controlled chaos engulfed the room. "What's happening?" Mason asked, his voice small and frightened. Reed looked down at his son's face, truly looked at him for the first time, and saw not an unwanted complication or a financial obligation, but a child balanced on the precipice of loss. "I don't know," Reed answered honestly, "but we'll face it together." The private waiting room outside the ICU held only 3 occupants. Reed, rigid in an uncomfortable chair, Mason curled into himself on a small sofa, and Olivia, just arrived from her shift, still in scrubs as she paced the small space. The tension between the adults was a palpable fourth presence. "They said it could be hours before we know anything," Olivia said, breaking the strained silence. "Mason, you should eat something." The boy shook his head, eyes fixed on the abstract painting across the room. His world, carefully constructed on the bedrock of his mother's love and his own resilience, was fracturing in ways he couldn't process. Grandmother Margaret, his link to the Blackwood side of his identity, lay fighting for her life. And his father, the man whose absence had shaped Mason's existence, suddenly occupied the same physical space, breathing the same recycled hospital air. Reed cleared his throat. "I can have food brought in. Whatever you'd like." "We're fine," Olivia responded automatically, the reflex of 12 years refusing his resources. Mason glanced between the adults, perceiving the currents of unspoken history. "I'd like a sandwich," he said quietly. "If that's okay." Something shifted in Reed's expression, relief at being allowed to provide this small thing perhaps. He stepped into the hallway to make arrangements, leaving mother and son momentarily alone. "You don't have to stay," Olivia told Mason, sitting beside him. "I can take you home." "I need to be here for Grandma Margaret," he replied with a conviction beyond his years. "And?" He hesitated, glancing toward the door where Reed had disappeared. "I want to stay." Olivia nodded, respecting her son's agency despite her protective instincts. "Just remember that whatever happens, whatever he says or doesn't say, it reflects on him, not on you." When Reed returned, an uncomfortable triangle formed as they awaited news. Mason, exhausted by emotion, eventually drifted to sleep on the sofa. Olivia covered him with her cardigan, then faced Reed directly for the first time that evening. "Why now?" she asked, keeping her voice low. "After 12 years of attorneys and NDAs and pretending he doesn't exist, why suddenly show up in his life?" Reed's gaze shifted to the sleeping boy. "My mother's condition." "Don't," Olivia interrupted. "Don't use Margaret as an excuse. She's been trying to bring you around for 8 years. Reed rubbed his temples, the facade of the confident financier cracking under accumulated stress. "I don't know what you want me to say, Olivia." "The truth would be refreshing," she replied. "We both know you saw the paternity test results before your lawyers buried them." A nurse appeared before Reed could respond, informing them that Margaret had been stabilized but remained critical. Visiting would be allowed briefly, one person at a time. "You should go," Olivia told Reed. "She's been waiting for you." Reed nodded, following the nurse down the sterile corridor. Margaret's room was dimly lit, the machines monitoring her condition creating a technological cocoon around her diminished form. Reed approached cautiously, as if his presence might somehow disturb the fragile balance keeping her alive. "Mother," he said softly, taking her hand. Margaret's eyes fluttered open, recognition dawning slowly. "Reed, you met him?" "Yes," Reed confirmed, unsure what else to say. "He has your mind," she whispered, "and your father's chess strategy." A ghost of a smile touched her lips, but Olivia's heart, thank God. Reed felt an unexpected sting behind his eyes. The doctors say you're stabilized. Margaret's expression suggested she knew better. I need your promise, Reed. No more hiding from your son, no more repeating Thomas's mistakes. It's not that simple, Reed protested. 12 years have passed. They have their lives, I have mine. What could I possibly offer him now? The truth, Margaret answered, echoing Olivia's earlier demand. About why you stayed away, about your father, about the fear that's ruled your life. Reed recoiled slightly. I'm not afraid. I've built an empire, taken risks that would paralyze most men. Financial risks, Margaret clarified, her voice weakening. Emotional safety is your prison, Reed, just like Thomas. The comparison to his father cut deep. Thomas Blackwood had been physically present but emotionally unavailable throughout Reed's childhood, a successful man by external metrics who had left emotional devastation in his wake. I'm nothing like him, Reed insisted. Prove it, Margaret challenged, squeezing his hand with surprising strength. Break the pattern. Reed sat beside his mother's bed long after she drifted back to sleep, her words echoing in his mind. Outside, Boston's lights glimmered against the night sky, the city continuing its rhythms indifferent to the personal reckonings happening within hospital walls. When Reed finally returned to the waiting room, he found Olivia asleep in a chair, her hand resting protectively near Mason. The boy, however, was awake, watching the door as if he'd been waiting. Their eyes met, identical shades of gray-blue, identical questions reflected. Is Grandma okay? Mason asked. Reed hesitated, then sat beside his son, deciding in that moment to offer what he'd never received as a child, honesty about difficult truths. She's very sick, he said quietly. The doctors are doing everything they can, but we should be prepared. Mason nodded, absorbing the information with solemn acceptance. She told me about your dad, how he was never really there even when he was there. Reed tensed, unprepared for his family history to be so directly acknowledged. Is that why you stayed away? Mason continued, his question free of accusation, simply seeking understanding. Because you didn't know how to be different from him? The insight from a 12-year-old struck Reed like a physical blow, the complex emotional equation he'd spent years avoiding, solved with childlike clarity. It's more complicated than that, Reed began automatically, then stopped himself, recognizing the deflection. Actually, I think you might be right. Dawn broke over Boston, painting the hospital room in soft light as Margaret Blackwood's condition continued its precarious stability. The night had passed in rotating vigils, with Reed, Olivia, and Mason taking turns sitting with her while the others attempted to rest in the waiting room. Reed stood at the window of the empty cafeteria, coffee cooling in his hand as he watched the city awaken. His phone buzzed continuously with messages from Blackwood Capital. The Jakarta investors were getting nervous. The market was reacting to acquisition news. Decisions needed his attention. For the first time in his career, Reed let the business world spin without his intervention. Your assistant brought these. Olivia approached, holding a small duffel bag. She said you might want to change. Reed glanced down at his rumpled suit, the same one he'd worn to yesterday's acquisition meeting. Thank you. And thank you for... He struggled to find the words. For allowing Mason to stay. Olivia set the bag down. I didn't allow anything. Mason makes his own choices about who deserves his time. The implied judgment wasn't lost on Reed. He's a remarkable boy. Yes, he is. Olivia's expression softened slightly. He asked me a question this morning that I couldn't answer. What was that? He wanted to know if you ever asked about him, over the years. She met his gaze directly. Did you? Reed could have lied, protected his image with the same skill he'd employed in boardrooms for decades. Instead, he chose honesty. No, he admitted. I made myself not think about him, about you. It was easier to write checks and pretend that fulfilled my obligation. Olivia nodded, having expected this answer but still feeling its sting. He deserves better than that. I know. Reed's admission hung between them, inadequate but sincere. Why did you really come yesterday? Olivia asked. Was it just for Margaret, or the inheritance she threatened to withhold? Reed considered the question, examining his motivations with uncomfortable clarity. Initially, yes. I came because of her ultimatum. He paused, struggling with unaccustomed vulnerability. But when I saw him in that room with her, playing chess, looking so much like... He stopped, overwhelmed by unexpected emotion. Like you, Olivia finished softly. Like me at that age, Reed agreed. Before I became... this. He gestured vaguely at himself, the expensive suit, the carefully constructed exterior of success. Before Olivia could respond, Mason appeared at the cafeteria entrance, his young face bearing the weight of interrupted sleep and emotional strain. The nurse said we should come quickly, he said, his voice steady despite the implication. They rushed to Margaret's room, finding Dr. Chen and a team monitoring her declining vitals. Her organs are beginning to fail, he explained gently. If there's anything you need to say... Reed approached the bed first, taking his mother's hand. Her eyes opened briefly, recognition flickering. I'm here, Mother, he said. We're all here. Margaret's gaze moved past him to Mason, who stood uncertainly at the foot of the bed. She beckoned weakly, and the boy moved to her side opposite Reed. My boys, she whispered, a smile touching her lips. Together at last. Mason took her other hand, forming a physical chain between grandmother, grandson, and the father who had only just begun to acknowledge the connection. I promise, Reed said quietly, answering her earlier demand. No more hiding. Margaret nodded almost imperceptibly, peace settling over her features, as if his words had released her final earthly concern. What followed was the sacred, terrible intimacy of bearing witness to life's end. Margaret's breathing grew increasingly labored until, with one final exhale, it ceased altogether. The monitor's steady tone confirmed what their hearts already knew. Mason's face crumpled, grief overcoming his careful composure. Without thinking, Reed reached across the bed and placed his hand on the boy's shoulder, an instinctive gesture of comfort between genetic mirrors. In the devastating quiet that followed, Olivia stood back, allowing father and son this unexpected moment of connection forged in loss. Whatever came next, something fundamental had shifted, a door forced open by death that had remained stubbornly closed in life. Margaret Blackwood's funeral reflected the woman herself, elegant, refined, and ultimately revealing of deeper truths than surface appearances suggested. Boston's financial and social elite filled Trinity Church, their presence less a tribute to the deceased than a recognition of her son's power and position. Reed stood at the front, delivering a eulogy that struck the expected notes of respect and admiration without revealing the complicated truths of their relationship. From the third row, Mason watched his father's performance with newfound understanding, recognizing the public mask that concealed private wounds. 3 days had passed since Margaret's death. 3 days of arrangements and legalities, of awkward encounters in hospital corridors and funeral homes. 3 days during which the tenuous connection formed at Margaret's bedside had neither strengthened nor dissolved, but existed in a fragile state of uncertainty. After the service, a smaller group gathered at Reed's penthouse for the reception. Mason moved uncomfortably through rooms larger than his entire apartment, observing the art pieces worth more than his mother's annual salary. Quite different from your place, isn't it? Reed's voice startled him as Mason studied a minimalist sculpture. Yeah, Mason agreed, unsure what else to say. The surreal nature of standing in his father's home, a space he'd imagined countless times but never in correct detail, left him uncharacteristically wordless. Reed gestured toward his study. There's something I'd like to show you if you have a moment. Mason glanced toward his mother, who was engaged in conversation with Vanessa near the windows. She nodded slightly, giving permission. The study was less sterile than the rest of the penthouse. Books filled floor-to-ceiling shelves, papers covered a substantial desk, and oddly, a vintage chess set occupied a small table by the window. "This was my grandfather's," Reed explained, noticing Mason's interest in the chess set. "The only thing I have from him." "Did you play with your dad?" Mason asked. Reed's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. "No. Thomas wasn't interested in games." Mason approached the board, examining the hand-carved pieces. "Grandma taught me. She said you were a master in college." "Almost," Reed acknowledged. "I competed at Dartmouth." An awkward silence settled between them, the weight of 12 years' absence pressing against tentative connection. "I have something for you," Reed said finally, retrieving an envelope from his desk. "It's the trust fund I tried to establish earlier. For your education, your future." Mason stared at the envelope without taking it. "Is that what you think I want from you? Money?" The directness of the question caught Reed off guard. "It's what I can offer," he replied, discomfort evident in his tone, "to make up for lost time." "You can't buy back 12 years, Mason said simply, without accusation. "And I don't need your money. Mom and I have been fine without it." Reed set the envelope down, familiar territory suddenly unstable beneath his feet. Financial solutions had always been his default response to emotional complications. "What do you want then?" he asked, genuine confusion in his voice. Mason considered the question with a maturity that belied his 12 years. "I want to know who you are. Not Reed Blackwood, the billionaire everyone out there is trying to impress. Just my father." The word, so simple, so loaded with meaning, struck Reed like a physical blow. Father, a title he'd legally denied, emotionally rejected, and strategically avoided for 12 years. "I'm not sure I know how to be that," Reed admitted, his customary confidence nowhere in evidence. "That's okay," Mason replied with unexpected compassion. "I'm not asking you to suddenly start coaching Little League or anything. Just, maybe we could play chess sometimes? Or you could come to my math competition next month?" The modest request, the willingness to begin with such small steps rather than demanding grand gestures of compensation, awakened something long dormant in Reed. This child, who had every right to anger and resentment, instead offered a path forward unencumbered by the weight of the past. "I would like that," Reed answered, surprising himself with his sincerity. A knock at the study door interrupted them. Olivia appeared, her expression carefully neutral. "Mason, we should go. You have school tomorrow." The boy nodded, then turned back to Reed. "Thanks for showing me the chess set. Perhaps next time we could play a game," Reed suggested, the words "next time" significant in their implication of continuation. As they prepared to leave, Reed found himself following them to the elevator, unwilling to simply return to his guests, as if this encounter were merely another social obligation fulfilled. "Olivia," he said as the elevator doors opened, "about the trust fund." "We've managed this long without your money, Reed," she interrupted, the old defensiveness resurfacing. "I know," he acknowledged, "but my mother's will." He hesitated, the legal details suddenly seeming coldly transactional compared to the human connection he'd just glimpsed. "We should discuss it when you're ready." Olivia's expression softened slightly at his uncharacteristic deference to her timeline rather than his own. "Call my office next week. We'll set something up." As the elevator doors began to close, Mason suddenly blocked them with his hand. Looking directly at Reed, he said the word that had gone unspoken between them since their first meeting. "Goodbye, Dad." The simple word, so commonplace for most, so extraordinary in this context, hit Reed with unexpected force. His carefully constructed composure crumbled, emotion overwhelming the defenses built over decades of practiced control. "Goodbye, Mason," he managed, his voice thick with feeling. When the elevator finally closed, Reed stood motionless in the hallway, confronting the reality that the protective walls he'd built around his heart had been breached not by Margaret's manipulations or Olivia's justified anger, but by the straightforward honesty of a 12-year-old boy who simply wanted to know his father. 3 months after Margaret Blackwood's funeral, Reed's sleek car navigated through Brighton's modest residential streets, drawing curious glances from neighbors. He parked outside the 2-story apartment building where Olivia and Mason lived, checking his watch. 5:45 p.m., 15 minutes early. The past 12 weeks had seen a careful reconstruction of boundaries and expectations, weekly chess games at neutral locations, attendance at Mason's regional math championship, which he won, awkward but increasingly comfortable conversations about school, interests, and the genetic traits they unmistakably shared. Reed approached the apartment building, recognition dawning that this was the first time he'd been invited to their home, their territory. The significance wasn't lost on him. Olivia answered his knock, her nurse's scrubs exchanged for casual evening wear. "You're early," she observed, stepping aside to let him enter. The apartment was smaller than Reed had imagined, but impeccably maintained. Academic certificates and awards covered one wall, Mason's achievements proudly displayed. Family photos occupied another, the boy's growth charted in posed school portraits and candid moments. Reed was struck by the visual record of all he had missed. "Mason's just finishing his homework," Olivia explained, leading him to a small dining area. "The reservation's at 7, so we have time." The dinner plans had been Mason's idea, his first school break since the reconnection began, and he had requested that both his parents take him to celebrate his math championship. A simple wish that required complex emotional navigation from the adults involved. "How is he doing with all of this?" Reed asked, genuine concern in his voice. Olivia considered the question. "Better than either of us, probably. He has questions, of course." "What kind of questions?" "Whether you'll disappear again," she answered directly. "Whether this is temporary or real." Reed nodded, the painful truth landing exactly as intended. "And what do you tell him?" "That I don't know," Olivia replied honestly. "That's up to you to demonstrate." Before Reed could respond, Mason appeared from his bedroom, his face lighting up at the sight of his father. "You came!" The simple pleasure in the boy's expression struck Reed powerfully. "Of course, I said I would." "I need to grab my jacket," Mason said, disappearing back into his room. Left momentarily alone with Olivia, Reed felt compelled to address the elephant that had occupied the space between them for 12 years. "I was wrong," he said quietly. "About everything. About you, about him, about what mattered." Olivia's expression remained guarded. "Why now, Reed? What changed?" He considered the question carefully, knowing the answer would determine much about their path forward. "I did," he said finally. "Or maybe I'm beginning to. Seeing myself reflected in him, recognizing patterns I was repeating from my own father. It's like looking in a mirror for the first time and actually seeing what's there." "It's not going to be easy," Olivia cautioned. "Building trust with a 12-year-old who spent his life wondering why he wasn't enough for you to stay." "I know," Reed acknowledged, "but he's worth the effort. I should have known that from the beginning." Mason returned wearing a jacket that was slightly too small, evidence of a recent growth spurt, carrying a folder of papers. "Can we stop by Blackwood Capital after dinner? I want to show you my project on algorithmic trading. Ms. Perez says it's advanced enough for high school level." The innocent request revealed how thoroughly Mason had researched his father's world, seeking connections despite the years of absence. Reed felt humbled by the persistent hope that had survived his rejection. "Of course," he agreed. "I'd like to see it." As they prepared to leave, Mason paused by a collection of framed photographs. "We should take a new picture," he suggested. "All 3 of us. For the wall." The proposal hung in the air, simple yet profound in its implication of continuity, of family, of belonging. Olivia glanced at Reed, a wordless question in her eyes. "I'd like that," he said, meaning it more deeply than he could express. Outside, as they walked toward Reed's car, Mason slipped his hand into his father's, a spontaneous gesture of trust that caught Reed by surprise. The small fingers interlacing with his own created a physical connection that mirrored the emotional bridge slowly forming between them. In that moment, Reed understood what his mother had tried to tell him, that true legacy wasn't measured in financial empires or company acquisitions, but in the human connections that endured beyond individual lifetimes. The Blackwood family pattern of emotional abandonment could end with him if he chose a different path from the one Thomas had modeled. As they drove toward the restaurant, Mason chattering excitedly about his project, while Olivia contributed occasional comments, Reed glimpsed a version of his life he'd never allowed himself to imagine, one where professional success coexisted with personal fulfillment, where the Blackwood name represented not just financial acumen but emotional integrity. It wouldn't be easy. 12 years of absence couldn't be erased by 3 months of presence. Trust would need to be earned daily, patterns actively unlearned, wounds acknowledged rather than covered with financial bandages. But watching Mason's animated expression in the rearview mirror, seeing his own features illuminated by a joy he'd rarely experienced himself, Reed made a silent promise to his mother, to his son, and to himself. The cycle would end here. The word "Dad" would become not just a title, but an identity worth living up to. The true measure of wealth isn't found in financial statements or corporate acquisitions, but in the courage to face our deepest fears and break destructive generational patterns. Reed Blackwood built an empire while avoiding the emotional vulnerability that real connection requires, only to discover that success without meaningful relationships creates a hollow legacy. His journey reminds us that it's never too late to acknowledge our mistakes and begin the difficult work of redemption. The walls we build to protect ourselves often become our prisons, while the very connections we fear may hold the keys to our freedom. Sometimes the most valuable inheritance we can leave isn't measured in dollars, but in the healing we initiate when we choose a different path than the one that damaged us. True wealth lies in having the courage to hear the word "Dad" and recognize it not as a burden, but as life's most precious opportunity for transformation. Did this story move you in any way? Share your honest opinion in the comments and tell us, what rating from 0 to 10 would you give it? We'd also love to know where you're watching from. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell so you never miss a new story. And if this one touched your heart, another powerful one is waiting for you right here on the end screen. Click and keep feeling with us. Thank you for being here.